Pause for a moment with that sentence. Let it land. Because if you are someone who feels the world too deeply, someone who walks into a room and instantly knows who is hurting, who absorbs the anxiety of strangers before they speak, who cannot watch the news without carrying it with you for days, then Carl Jung was, in some way, speaking directly to you. You have been told your whole life that sensitivity is a gift, and it is, but no one told you about the shadow side of that gift. No one sat down with you and said, the same capacity that lets you feel everything is the same capacity that will eventually swallow you whole if you never learn what lives beneath it. Empaths don't break from feeling too much. They break from never learning how to process what they feel. And the tragedy, the deep Jungian tragedy, is that most empaths spend their entire lives helping others excavate their emotional wounds, while their own shadow grows in silence, unnamed, unexamined, and increasingly powerful. What does the empath's shadow look like? It looks like chronic exhaustion that no sleep can fix. It looks like rage that surfaces without warning and floods you with shame. It looks like self-betrayal dressed up as compassion. It looks like relationships where you give everything and receive almost nothing, and you cannot stop, because somewhere in your unconscious, you have made a silent deal. If I never show my own darkness, maybe they will let me stay. Jung spent decades inside the human unconscious, his own and others. He developed a map, not a perfect map, but the most honest one we have. And what that map reveals about empaths is both devastating and deeply liberating. In this video, we are going to walk into the parts of the empath's psyche that most psychology content will never touch. We are going to look at the archetypes that shape you, the shadow patterns that silently destroy your closest relationships, the unconscious contracts you never agreed to but have been honoring your entire life, and the only path that leads to real wholeness. This is not a video about self-care. This is a video about self-confrontation. Now let's go where it is dark enough to finally see clearly. Here is the paradox that no one prepares empaths for. The very capacity that makes you extraordinary is the same capacity that, without proper integration, becomes a cage you built yourself, and then forgot you were the one who locked the door. To understand how this happens, we need to go deeper than the word empath. We need to go into the structure of the psyche itself, because that is where Jung worked, and that is where the real answers live. Carl Jung described the human psyche not as a single unified mind, but as a complex, layered system, a kind of inner cosmos populated by archetypes, complexes, instincts, and autonomous processes that operate far beneath conscious awareness. At the center of this system is what he called the self, not the ego, not the personality, but the organizing principle of the entire psyche, the deepest layer of what we are. Most people live their lives almost entirely in the ego, the conscious identity, the social mask, the story we tell about who we are. But empaths, by their very nature, live closer to the unconscious than most. They feel things that cannot be explained. They sense undercurrents that others miss. They are, in a very literal Jungian sense, more porous. The boundary between their conscious awareness and the vast unconscious world is thinner than in most people. Jung would have recognized the empath immediately. He would have understood that this porousness is not a disorder and not a superpower. It is a psychological configuration, one that comes with profound gifts and with equally profound vulnerabilities. The gift is real, the empath's capacity for resonance, for genuinely inhabiting the emotional reality of another person, is not performance. It is not politeness or learned behavior. It is a form of deep perception, a way of knowing the world through feeling rather than through analysis. In a psychologically healthy form, this is the foundation of genuine compassion, intuitive wisdom, and relational depth that most people spend their entire lives searching for. But here is what happens when this gift is never accompanied by a corresponding inner structure. by strong enough psychological boundaries, by a clear enough sense of self, by the willingness to face one's own emotional content. The empath becomes a vessel without walls, and a vessel without walls does not hold. It absorbs. Think about what this means in practice. From childhood, and for most empaths this begins very early, the sensitivity that was supposed to be a doorway into deep human connection became instead a survival mechanism. You felt your parents' anxiety before they spoke. You learned to read the emotional temperature of every room before deciding whether it was safe to be fully yourself. You became exquisitely attuned to what others needed, what they feared, what would make them comfortable, because some part of you understood, on a pre-rational, pre-verbal level, that your own emotional experience was too intense for the people around you to hold. So you did what all sensitive children do. You adapted. You became the one who asked, "Are you okay?" before you would learn to ask that of yourself. You became the family's emotional regulator, the friend who always listened, the partner who always understood. And in the absence of anyone reflecting your own emotional world back to you with equal care, you began to do something that Jung would have found deeply significant. You began to live in other people's feelings, because your own feelings had nowhere safe to go. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what happens when only one personality is doing all the transforming? What happens when the empath is always the one who adjusts, absorbs, accommodates, and the other person remains unchanged? You stop being transformed. You start being consumed. This is the first great dark truth about the empath's gift. It is not a wound in itself, but without integration, without the conscious work of understanding what you feel, why you feel it, and where your feelings end and another person's begin, it becomes a wound by default. The gift, unexamined, becomes a trap. And the trap is lined with something that feels unmistakably like love. Sensitivity without self-knowledge is not a gift. It is an open door to a house with no one guarding the threshold. The empath's greatest act of self-destruction does not happen in the presence of a difficult person. It happens in silence, alone, in the moment they decide that their own pain is less important than keeping the peace. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow is often simplified, reduced to the idea that we all have a dark side. But that is not what Jung meant. The shadow is not evil. It is not the worst of us. It is the disowned parts of us, the emotional content, the traits, the impulses, the entire dimensions of the self that we learned early in life were unacceptable, dangerous, or simply unwelcome. For the empath, the shadow is constructed in a very specific way. And understanding that construction is the beginning of real psychological freedom. Think about what an empath learns very young is acceptable and what is not. It is acceptable to feel others' pain. It is not acceptable to feel, or certainly not to express, your own anger. It is acceptable to give endlessly. It is not acceptable to have needs. It is acceptable to absorb emotional difficulty. It is not acceptable to create it, even when you are the one who has been harmed. It is acceptable to be a source of comfort. It is not acceptable to be a source of demand. These early lessons, absorbed not from textbooks but from the lived experience of what brought approval and what brought withdrawal of love, create a very particular psychological structure. The empath builds an entire identity around their sensitivity and their care, and in doing so, they push everything that contradicts that identity into the shadow. What gets buried? Far more than most empaths ever realize. Anger gets buried. Not just anger in the explosive sense, but the healthy, protective, self-defining fire of a person who knows what is not acceptable to them, who can say no without drowning in guilt, who can hold a boundary without immediately apologizing for having one. For the empath, anger is often so thoroughly exiled into the shadow that when it does emerge, as it always eventually does, because the psyche does not surrender its content willingly, it comes out sideways, in passive aggression, in sudden unexplained withdrawals, in the collapse of relationships that had been held together entirely by the empath's silent sacrifice. Ego strength gets buried, not arrogance, not narcissism, but the healthy, non-negotiable sense of self that allows a person to say, "This is who I am. This is what I need. This matters." The empath, trained from infancy to prioritize the emotional reality of others, often has no consistent relationship with their own preferences, their own desires, their own vision of what their life should look like, because for so long, their own inner world was the least attended to room in the house. The capacity for self-assertion gets buried, not violence, but the primal ability to claim space, to move toward what you want without immediately checking whether it will inconvenience someone else. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is not a metaphor. This is a clinical observation made across decades of psychoanalytic work with real human beings in real psychological pain. For the empath, the unconscious shadow complex most commonly manifests in the pattern of relationships. You are drawn to people who need you, not because you chose them consciously, but because the unconscious knows that a person who needs you will not abandon you for having needs of your own. The unconscious has made a calculation. The safest love is the love that requires you to stay small and helpful and endlessly available. You attract people who are emotionally unavailable, wounded, or subtly controlling, not because something is wrong with you, but because your shadow is running a script that your conscious mind never agreed to. The script says, you are only safe when you are needed. You are only loved when you are giving. If you stop being useful, you will be alone. That script was written in childhood. It is not true. But until you bring it into consciousness, until you look directly at it in the light, it will run your life. And the worst part? The empath, trained to be exquisitely aware of everyone else's psychology, is often the last person in the room to see their own. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the abandoned child within you, and it will keep screaming in the language of symptoms and heartbreak until you finally turn around. What if the compulsion to help others, the drive you have always called love, is not entirely love at all, but an archetype wearing the mask of love to keep you from facing something far older and far closer to home? Carl Jung proposed that the psyche is not only personal, it is also universal, connected through what he called the collective unconscious to a vast reservoir of shared human experience, encoded in patterns he called archetypes. Archetypes are not characters in a story. They are living psychological forces, deep pre-rational patterns of emotion, behavior, and meaning that operate in the unconscious and find expression through the images, compulsions, relationships, and symptoms of individual human lives. For empaths, 3 archetypes are of particular importance. The first is the wounded healer. This archetype appears throughout mythology, world religion, and depth psychology. It is the figure who has suffered, who has descended into their own wound, and who emerges not cured, but transformed by suffering into someone capable of genuine compassion for the suffering of others. In Greek mythology, it is Chiron, the centaur, immortal, wise, teacher of heroes, who carries a wound that will not heal, and who uses that wound as the very source of his healing gift. In the life of the empath, the wounded healer archetype is nearly always present. The empath who has been through loss, through emotional neglect, through experiences of feeling invisible or unheard, that person has genuine access to a form of compassionate understanding that those who have been protected from pain simply do not possess. But the wounded healer has a shadow side that is rarely discussed. When the empath has not consciously worked with their own wound, has not descended into it intentionally, has not processed its content, the archetype operates in reverse. Instead of using the wound as a source of wisdom, the empath uses other people's wounds as a way of avoiding their own. You become obsessively focused on others' pain because focusing on your own feels unbearable. You are drawn to healers' roles not only from genuine care, but because in the presence of someone else's suffering, you feel competent, necessary, and temporarily safe from the requirement to examine your own interior. This is not selfishness. It is a coping mechanism so intelligent it disguises itself as virtue. The second archetype is the martyr. In its shadow form, and for empaths under stress, this is the form it most often takes. The martyr becomes the person who suffers in silence as a form of control, whose self-erasure is a way of making others feel guilty without ever having to say a word. The martyr gives and gives and gives, and then feels devastated, even betrayed, when the other person does not give back in equal measure, even though they never asked clearly for anything. This pattern breaks relationships, and it breaks them in a way that leaves the empath confused, because from their perspective, they did everything right. How could it not be enough? Because you cannot build real intimacy on self-erasure. You can only build dependency. Jung wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." The empath who has cut off their anger, their ego, their right to take up space, they are not whole. They are performing half of a person, and no relationship built with half of a person will ever truly satisfy the half that is buried, waiting, growing in the dark. The third archetype, the most foundational, is the abandoned child. This is not always a literal abandonment, it is an emotional one. The experience, usually from very early childhood, of having one's inner emotional world met with dismissal, correction, or simply silence. The sensitive child who was told, "You're too sensitive." The intuitive child who was met with, "You're imagining things." The child whose emotional reality was consistently treated as less important than the emotional reality of the adults around them. That child does not disappear when the body grows. That child goes underground, into the shadow. And from there, it runs the most powerful script in the empath's entire psychological system. I am not safe to be fully seen. If I show all of who I am, my darkness, my needs, my anger, my desires, I will be abandoned, and I will not survive it. This script is the engine beneath every pattern we have discussed. It is why the empath stays too long in relationships that have already ended in spirit, hoping that if they just give a little more, work a little harder, feel a little more deeply, something will finally shift. The abandoned child believes that love is something you earn through self-erasure. And until that belief is brought into consciousness, examined, grieved, and released, it will be the gravitational center of the empath's entire relational life. You are not broken. You are haunted by archetypes that were never named, and naming them is the first act of liberation. The most radical thing an empath can do is not give more love. It is stop giving it from a wound and start giving it from a self that is finally whole. Now we arrive at the most important thing Jung ever said. Not the most quoted, not the most decorative, the most important. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you were trained to be, not who others needed you to be, not the archetype your family cast you in before you were old enough to know you were being cast. Who you truly are. Jung called this process individuation, and it is, without question, the most demanding, most rewarding, and most misunderstood concept in all of depth psychology. It is often described as becoming yourself, which is technically accurate but dangerously incomplete, because what it actually requires is not the discovery of some preformed true self waiting to be uncovered, but the active, painful, ongoing work of integrating all the parts of yourself that you have disowned, denied, suppressed, and projected onto others. For the empath, individuation is not a philosophical project, it is a survival necessity. The first step is meeting the shadow, not defeating it, not eliminating it, not performing enough self-improvement to rise above it, meeting it. The way you meet a person you have been avoiding for years, with honesty, with discomfort, and with the willingness to finally hear what they have to say. For the empath, meeting the shadow means sitting with the feelings labeled unacceptable, the anger, the jealousy, the desire to be seen that was disguised as indifference, the hunger for reciprocity that was buried under protestations of selflessness. It means asking the questions that your psychological defenses have been working very hard to prevent you from asking. Why do I consistently attract relationships where I give more than I receive? What am I afraid would happen if I said clearly what I need? Whose pain am I most compelled to absorb, and does it somehow resemble my own? Where in my body do I feel the emotion I have not yet allowed myself to name? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that begin the journey from unconscious empath, from a person at the mercy of their own sensitivity, to what Jung would have called an individuated consciousness, someone who feels deeply and knows why, who gives freely and from genuine choice rather than from fear. The second step is the integration of opposites. For the empath, who has often overdeveloped the receptive, relational, self-dissolving dimension of consciousness while suppressing other dimensions, the assertive, the boundary-setting, the self-directed, individuation requires bringing those opposites into dialogue. This is not about becoming less sensitive, it is about becoming more whole. It is about discovering that you can feel deeply and still say no, that you can hold space for another person's pain and still protect your own energy, that compassion and self-sovereignty are not opposites, they are the two pillars of any psyche strong enough to bear the weight of real love. Jung wrote, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The empath who has spent their life looking outside, into others' emotional worlds, others' needs, others' suffering, is extraordinarily good at the looking. The question that individuation asks is, can you turn that same gaze inward and bear what you find there? The third step is perhaps the most radical, learning to become a compassionate witness to yourself. The empath has spent a lifetime extending compassion outward, to strangers, to partners, to friends in crisis, but to themselves? The inner critic of an empath is not a quiet voice. It is a prosecuting attorney, relentless, exacting, capable of building an airtight case for why everything that has ever gone wrong is somehow the empath's fault for not caring enough, not giving enough, not feeling in the right direction. To turn that same capacity for deep attunement toward yourself, to feel your own pain with the same non-judgmental presence you offer to others, is for the empath an act of profound psychological courage. When you can do this, when you have sat with your anger, your grief, your abandoned child, your buried desires, your unspoken needs, and met them not with shame, but with recognition, something fundamental shifts in the architecture of your psyche. You stop absorbing others' emotions because you are no longer starving for the emotional depth you have been denying yourself. You stop attracting people who need rescuing
because you are no longer unconsciously seeking to earn love through usefulness. You stop giving from emptiness because you have found, in the excavation of your own interior, a source of fullness that does not depend on anyone else's approval or gratitude. You become, in the truest Jungian sense, whole. Not healed in the sense of having no wounds.
Whole in the sense of having integrated your wounds into the larger story of who you are and discovered that they were all along the most important chapters. The path to wholeness runs directly through the shadow. There is no road around it, only through it, and you were always strong enough to walk it. We have traveled a long way in this conversation. We began in the paradox, the empath's gift that becomes a prison. We moved through the shadow, the buried anger, the suppressed ego, the silent scripts that run beneath the surface of every relationship. We met the archetypes, the wounded healer, the martyr, the abandoned child, and understood for the first time why they have shaped your choices in ways your conscious mind could never fully explain. And we arrived at the path, the narrow, demanding, deeply rewarding path of individuation that leads not to a life without pain, but to a life where pain no longer defines you. If something in this video struck close to home, if some part of this felt less like information and more like recognition, like a word finally found for something you have been trying to name for years, then I want to say something directly to that part of you. What you feel is not a malfunction. It is not too much. It is not a problem to be managed or a wound to be hidden. It is one of the rarest and most essential gifts a human being can carry. But like all great gifts, it requires stewardship. It requires consciousness. It requires the courage to look inward with the same depth of attention you have always, so instinctively, turned outward. Carl Jung spent his entire life arguing for one thing, beneath all the theory and the archetypes and the carefully constructed psychological systems, that the most important journey a human being can take is the journey into their own interior. Not to find perfection there, not to find a self that is pure and unburdened, but to find everything, the light and the shadow, the gift and the wound, the child who was abandoned, and the adult who has the capacity now to return to them. The empath who has integrated their shadow does not feel less, they feel more, but from a place of rootedness, not from a place of drowning. They love more deeply because they are loving from wholeness rather than from deficit. They hold space for others more genuinely because they have finally, after a lifetime of looking outward, learned to hold space for themselves. There is a particular silence that descends when something has finally been understood, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of completion, of something that was circling for years finally finding the place where it belongs. If this video brought you closer to that silence, even by a fraction, then something real happened here. Go gently. The shadow does not respond to force. It responds to attention, to the willingness to look. To the radical quiet act of turning toward yourself and saying, I am here, I am listening. What have you been trying to tell me? That is where it begins. If this exploration resonated with you, I would be deeply honored to have you as part of this community. We go into the dark so we can find the light that was always there. Subscribe and bring someone who needs to hear this.